Solving the climate crisis is the greatest and most complex challenge that we have ever faced. The main solution, however, is so simple.
I was going to spend time just explaining sort of the way that we think about the world, and thanks to Nirvana for inviting us to speak and be a part of what's happening. At SharpEnd, we look at the real world as a connected platform. I think when you look away from traditional advertising methods and you say, okay, well, if everything's becoming more connected, what's the role of brands, and how do you build brand equity in those connected environments? That tends to be where SharpEnd becomes more relevant. We've been going for 4.5 years. Based in Nirvana's offices, very happily, Gary and Spencer, and we focus quite a lot on really just building brands in a connected world. So that's the story that I'm going to tell you. I'm not as good for the planet as Nick, I don't think. Neither is SharpEnd, but we try and do our bit. So this is much more around how do you tell your story through your products, and then how do you apply sustainable behaviour change as one of the potential applications. So the reason that SharpEnd set up was because we noticed that the traditional format of building brands was around messaging, which is how do I get my advert and my story in front of the most people in the most amount of ways. What's happened with technology innovation and digital disruption, depending on if you have a speech impediment like I do, or if you've got in the industry, is that the opportunities to message people are reducing, and actually the opportunities to advertise are disappearing. So when you start looking at Apple Watches, when you start looking at AirPods, when you start looking at the kind of zero UI movement, suddenly if you're a brand that's built itself through print advertising, digital banners, and kind of these kind of push methods, suddenly you start needing to think, okay, well, what's the way that we build our brand moving forward? We think the answer is brand behaviour. So how do you behave in connected spaces? How do you directly involve yourself in consumers' lives and basically try and help either them live their life a bit better or help make the world a better place? And hopefully that drives a new form of equity. What we also find working in our space, which is largely defined as the Internet of Things, is that traditionally the role of advertising has been to get people to buy stuff. So you advertise with people, they go to a store, they buy it, suddenly that's the end of the relationship. You then go back and do the same thing again, hoping that they'll still buy the same thing. What you find with the Internet of Things, when you start to look at the real world as a connected platform, is actually you can start to build brands post-purchase. So what we're not doing is we're not saying that the role of advertising isn't to drive awareness and drive consideration, but we're saying that the role of technology innovation is to change the way that people consider your products and change the way that people engage with your products. So that's what we're going to try and give some examples of today. But ultimately we see the opportunity is to build brands post-purchase. That's our starting point. We focus as a business, and this is not a sales pitch, we focus on 4 areas: fashion, cosmetics, wines and spirits, and FMCG. The reason being is that we find the problems are all the same across those 4 categories. And if you look at the problems, it's, how do I learn more about how my products are bought and used? How do I engage and convert shoppers at point of sale? And how do I expand my ecosystem of touch points around the consumer? So ultimately, I spend my time having the same conversation with Sif as I do with Bulgari. It's an interesting predicament. And that's one of my demos.
Just a board, all good.
So ultimately, what I'm going to try and do now is just whiz you through a couple of case studies. Hopefully that then goes, shit, that's kind of interesting, and then you start kind of thinking about the process and maybe applying it back to your business. Rather than thinking about reducing the amount of packaging in the world, which I think is the role of smarter and more ethical people, I think that my role is to try and say, okay, if you are going to make stuff and if you are going to sell stuff, how do you make that stuff smarter, more interactive, and hopefully then apply sustainable behaviour change applications on top of it. So we're trying to do the same thing, but we're just going about it in slightly different ways. So connected clothing and packaging. When you're a producer of stuff, whether it's handbags, bottles of whiskey, cartons of milk, bottles of perfume, or whatever, you ultimately tend to lose the relationship at the point of retail. So you normally sell into retail, or you sell through your own stores, but ultimately you don't know who buys and uses your product. So ultimately the first job is, if I can understand who buys and uses my product, I can start to understand more about them, which is going to allow me to deliver services and experiences which are going to help to build brand equity, but also then perhaps we can start thinking about ways of changing the world. So the first thing to imagine with connected packaging or connected clothing, which is slightly weird to put together, but ultimately, like I said, the problem is the same about learning consumers who buy and use your products. But the first thing to ask is a very difficult question, which is always a good place to start. Being cynical is always a good starting point in the creative process, but why would anyone tap or scan a product with their smartphone? And ultimately, I think the role of connected packaging or connected clothing is to heighten the enjoyment in the context of use, which sounds very smart, but I ultimately think that it's quite obvious when you start going through the creative process, because ultimately if you've got a phone and you've got a thing, you tend to be in a very, very close proximity to both. So this isn't a digital messaging practice where you assume that this person's on a social media platform or on a website trying to get a banner or an ad unit. Actually, the carton of milk's here, or the shirt's on, or the pair of jeans are worn, or the bottle of wine's about to be opened, and it's about how do you use that as your creative jumping off point. So one of the products that we've just gone live with in the US was about telling the product story, which is a brand called Bowen Wines. We just did 1 million NFC-enabled wine bottles, which was the world's largest rollout of NFC. If you don't know what NFC is, but if you know what mobile payments are, or if you have traveled on the underground, that's using NFC, which is a tap-to interaction. What we've now done is take that technology and apply it onto physical consumer goods. So jeans, bottles of perfume, Malibu bottles, if you're still drinking Malibu, you're a bit too old. And no offense, that was a slightly different joke that I was trying to make. Just sounded like an insult. Anyway. So the idea is that across the US, you can buy a bottle of Californian wine called Bowen, and you can access information about where the grapes come from, all about the appellation. You can start to understand the story of the farmer. You can understand the production process. You can then start to access services around meat and cheese pairings, because everyone likes to pretend they know what goes with what. You can start to understand more about the tasting notes, because everyone likes to understand they know how to taste wine. You can look at inspirational places to go and enjoy the wine in your local area, so there's a really contextual element. And then from the business's perspective, they can start to tie different products to different consumers. So using the virtual wine cellar, you can know if they've got the Pinot Noir and the Chardonnay. And then from a business's perspective, how do you advertise differently to the person who you know has 2 products in your portfolio? So ultimately it's about service value, experience definition, designing around the consumer in the context of use, and then using those insights to make better business decisions. We tend not to talk about the idea, tend not to talk about how great the platform is, but we say what business decisions can you make off the back of the insights that you're generating? Can you plan media differently? Can you spend less money on acquiring customer data? And ultimately, once you start talking to the consumer, you really stop advertising. So I guess the methodology is kind of fairly robust in the sense that if a product could speak, what does it say? That's really our sort of jumping off point. If you look at some of the work that we're doing with Bulgari, which is a part of the LVMH group, they're using connected handbags to be able to deliver messages of authenticity. So there's an anti-counterfeit business application. They can tell the story of the materials that are within the bag, and ultimately they can then start to think about the services and experiences that people who can afford Bulgari handbags would want to access. So that's kind of an interesting way of looking at it. It's not just about consumer engagement, but it's about telling the story of the product first and then using that interaction to then drive a consumer engagement platform afterwards. So this is the Serpenti range. This is available in 4 countries, and basically there's NFC capability, so you can just go towards the phone, go towards the bag, unlock your iPhone or Android device, go within 5 centimeters of the bag, and then a digital platform will launch on your handset. More relevant to today's topics is the work that we've been doing with Unilever. Biggest problem with recycling in the UK is that you can't do it nationally because every single council has different recycling capabilities. Therefore, we were looking at connected packaging as a way of solving that problem, because if you know where the product is, you know where the consumer is, and then you can start to tell them, okay, well this is the product that you're scanning, this bit goes in this bin, this bit goes in this bin, this bit goes in this bin. And by the way, did you know that by recycling that item, you've now powered the local school for 15 minutes, so you can start to deliver some really interesting sort of behaviour change applications on top of it. So this is an app called Sort Scanner. It was called Recycling Rewards, which again didn't lend itself very well to my speech impediment, so we changed it. And then you can obviously see here where the sustainable living plan is starting to come to life through packaging. So Unilever has a big initiative around doubling sales and halving carbon footprint. Obviously this goes quite a long way in terms of saving money on landfill tax, because you can actually show the government you're making a difference in trying to promote sustainable behaviour change. So then the next thing is, how do we enable our products without impacting the production lines? It sounds really great to say, let's NFC enable everything, or let's put QR codes or barcodes on absolutely every single thing that we make and sell. It is kind of difficult. So I think one of the things that I would, I'm not too sure on who I'm sort of talking to as a broad audience, but what I would say is, within the 4 verticals that we work across, it's very important for us to have supply chain integrations where if you can push your suppliers to actually bring connectivity into your products and into your stuff, it's really just about the application on top of that. So rather than working backwards from the idea, you can actually have the creative definition and the technical solution working side by side. As an example, Goala Closures Group is the world's leading closures producer for the wines and spirits market, if anyone wasn't aware of that. And ultimately they produce, I think it's 15 billion closures a year. So we were appointed as the global Internet of Things agency for Pernod Ricard. One of the things that they were asking us was, how do you create production efficiencies around NFC enabling our bottles? So we essentially developed a platform that manages up to billions of identities, so every single product having its own URL. So everyone in this room has some form of a social media profile. We're giving the same thing to products, so a digital version of itself in the cloud. Manage those on the platform, give those IDs to Goala. Goala then applies them onto the top of bottle caps, which is not something I thought I'd be doing when I left school. And then ultimately it's about then working with the brand to be able to activate the technology. One of the reasons I'm most kind of excited about sort of sharing an office with Nirvana is obviously as our fashion partner, and a lot of our kind of creative service expertise comes from those guys, because whether you're looking at fashion, wines and spirits, cosmetics or pharmaceuticals or FMCG, you're going to need to be able to push your suppliers to say, well actually if we're making lots and lots of stuff, there must be little fixes that we can make in the supply chain to make it more interactive, and then it's a question of, if my product is now able to speak, which it is, what can we allow it to say to our consumers? And then you can also start looking at things like building lab spaces in your buildings. So this is something that we built in the Malibu head office, got loads of weird and wonderful prototypes around technologies, but ultimately if the real world is a connected platform, you should want to get into the real world as quickly as possible. So no more workshops, no more decks, no more sketches. Start building lo-fi proof of concepts, get stuff into people's hands in your offices, get them playing around with these technologies, get them to see what difference it can make, and then start doing some pilots and some test and learns and doing some scale programming. So, in summary, it's a creative problem, it's not a technical one. There's people that are able to solve the technical solutions, and then really it's about that creative proposition of heightening the enjoyment in the context of use, using the product as another platform in which to tell your story. Start small, build really, really bad prototypes in the office, show them to people, get people excited, move into pilot, get some initial learnings, and then look at scaling the ones that work. And yeah, thank you very much.